Well, good afternoon. I mentioned to you earlier this morning with a post that I would be looking at mixology, theology, and really covering kind of what we did on Wednesday night because a number of people weren't able to be a part of that. And Sunday, we embarked on this journey last Sunday, the beginning of Jesus' final journey. And it's a study of Mark's gospel. And, as the sign of the cross was placed on our foreheads on Ash Wednesday, we began to recognize that we are humans once again. We will die. There will come an end to our life. So we live as Christians with a promise, a transformational promise, a transfiguring promise. Jesus had begun his final journey to Jerusalem and the cross and the resurrection, which is what Lent really is about. And we have already looked at the healing of a blind man and metaphorically the blindness of the disciples, which is part of Mark's messianic secret, his drawing us into the story with the feeding of the 5,000 and the disciples just kind of not getting it. And then, of course, this all led to Peter's great confession that you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And we remember this, and that becomes our confession, our profession as well. And so tonight, we begin once again with Jesus predicting his death and resurrection. And it doesn't go over so well. In verse 31, it says, "Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later, he would rise from the dead." Well, and it goes on in verse 32 and says, "As we talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at the disciples and then reprimanded Peter. 'Get away from me, Satan,' he said. 'You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's.'" Reprimand may be too mild a word. Sternly, strongly, vehemently might be a better translation. In other words, Jesus let him have it. He was, there is nothing, Jesus is saying, that's going to stop him from fulfilling the Father's mission to save humanity. Nothing will stand in his way, not even Peter, the leader of the disciples. So, again, Mark reminds us of Jesus' purpose, and as the gospel writer draws us in and says, we can't stand in his way either. We can't be in the way of what God is doing. Mark reminds us of the purpose of the gospel. And as the writer wants us to feel a part of this, don't let anything, and this is a word to us, don't let anything interfere with Jesus' mission in your life. And I think that would be either you're on his side or you're not on his side. Peter's still looking for the Messiah to come, who's going to be a revolutionary, who's going to turn everything upside down and kick the Romans out. But that's not what Jesus is about. His kingdom's not of this world. So next, almost a week goes by, probably a pretty tense week, I would say, with the apostles. Peter, the leader of the apostles, just got a tongue lashing. And Mark goes on to say 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up to a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus appeared transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. And Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He said this because he really didn't know what else to say, for they were terrified. Yeah, terrified. There's Moses the prophet, the giver of the law. There's Elijah, who was promised to come before the Messiah came. And they're there chatting with Jesus. I think what we're seeing is something beyond just a transfiguration of Jesus. I think we're seeing a glimpse into heaven. I think we're seeing things on the other side, so to speak. All the prophets of the Old Testament predicted certain things before the Messiah would come, and Jesus was he. Mark sees this as confirmation of who Jesus is. And Peter, James, and John were just terrified because they didn't know what was going on. And in fact, to this day, if you go to the Mount of Transfiguration, and I remember standing there and walking into the chapel that is built on top of the Mount of Transfiguration, there is a chapel on either side of the main chapel. The main chapel is, of course, the Christian worship center. And then on either side, there's a chapel for Moses and a chapel for Elijah. And there's Jesus in the center. Peter, James, and John were trying to figure out what was going on. Jesus, just 6 days earlier, had predicted his death. And now this incredible event takes place. Verse 7 said that a cloud overshadowed them. A voice of the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they only saw Jesus with them. What were they to think? What did they just experience? They just had a glimpse into eternity, into heaven. What must have thought? You know, standing on the top of that mountain, and you begin to look over the land of Israel, the drama now continues to play out. Can you imagine the first church that heard this gospel read? When I stood on that Mount of Transfiguration and saw the land of Israel, I marveled at what stretched out before me, the Holy Land, my ancestral land of faith. But I couldn't stay there. Neither could Peter, James, and John with Jesus. I had to move on, and so did Jesus. What would be next? Well, Jesus goes back to work right away. In Mark chapter 8, one of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so that you could heal him. He's possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whatever this spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground, and then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciple to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Now, at this point, I think Jesus once again feels the frustration. And he says, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." You know, this shows us the humanity of Jesus, that he gets frustrated with our inability to see his purpose, his plan, and what the Father is doing. How long? How long, Jesus is asking. Jesus has feelings. He's real. He's frustrated. How long will I be with you? And you just don't get it. I suppose every pastor probably have said that to his congregation. Are you going to take this seriously? Are you going to take the study of the Word and worship and following Jesus seriously? Or is it just a game we play? Is Jesus real to us? Or are we just kind of going through this as a ritual? The Father declares something that should come out of each of our mouths. And that is, I believe you, Jesus. I believe what you say. In verse 22, have mercy on us and help us if you can. And Jesus is saying, what do you mean, if I can? Anything is possible if a person believes. The Father instantly cries out. And I feel as if we're crying out for the evil that's in us, the disappointment, the failures in us, the lack of commitment to Jesus that's in us. I do believe. Help me in my unbelief. This is faith, friends. This is faith. We are weak, but Jesus, who is the object of our faith, is strong. Anything is possible for those who believe. What an incredible, incredible vision this creates for us. In verse 30, as they travel through Galilee, Jesus once again predicts his suffering and death. And how do the apostles react? Verse 32, they didn't understand what he was saying. However, they were afraid to ask him what he meant. Well, he's done it for the third time. They don't want to know. They can't believe that this is the outcome of the Messiah. We'll fight with him. We'll fight alongside him. They didn't understand what he meant. Mark does it again. He draws us into the place of the apostles. You know, the apostles are every man, every woman. They are like us. Without faith, none of this matters. So I ask, as we really start this Lenten season in full, without faith, what does this matter? Where does this leave us? Where are you on your journey as you begin this Lent? Are you happy with the cultural Jesus? And, you know, do you really want to let it affect your life? Does it change anything? Does it demand anything? We will find out more on this final journey of Jesus, and we'll be doing it again this Sunday. So that's a little look at the Ash Wednesday service and what it meant to me, and a quick summary of the message. So I hope you join me Sunday as we look deeper on this final journey of Jesus. Thanks for joining me for Mixology Theology today on the 20th of February. Take care and